I'm David Auden from St. Louis, and I am a professor of theology at St. Louis University, a Jesuit-run university. I teach courses on all the religions of the world, and my main focus throughout my adult life has been the role that religion can play in bringing peace and justice to the world. My doctorate is in philosophies and theologies of peace and justice. And for many years, I've been a committed world federalist, as many of you have been. What is so exciting to me about Professor Schwartzberg's book is that it goes completely against the impression that some people have about World Federation, that it is simply utopian and unworkable, that it'll never happen. What Joe shows in his book, of course, is that there are many practical ways in which we can go from the current United Nations Confederacy to a World Federation, and how we can change it through weighted voting. And that's going to be our discussion today, how Joe's proposal is workable and practical, and how it's much improved over some other systems of weighted voting. So in Chapter 2, he deals with the problem of how with the United Nations General Assembly, the problem is one nation, one vote, regardless of its population and regardless of its contribution to the UN system. And the other problem is that even if the General Assembly passes resolutions, they are non-binding. They simply say what nations should do, but even if a nation votes for a resolution, it really doesn't mean that they have to do that. So it's not a question of creating world law. The UN system is based on the principle of international law, which is a matter of treaties and how to get the nations of the world to cooperate with each other. But what Joe's book shows is that there are ways in which we can radically transform that system so that the General Assembly could create world law, and then how the Security Council could make sure then that it would be enforced. So the practical problem with one nation, one vote is that you've got 193 members of the United Nations, most of the nations of the world, but of course the population within those countries is dramatically different. You've got the extremes of China having 1.38 billion people, almost 1.5 billion people just in China. And the other extreme that Joe mentions would be Tuvalu with just 10,000 people, or Nauru with now 11,000 people. And all the other nations of the world are in between those two extremes. And he also mentions how 39 nations of the world have less than 1 million people, and 13 have less than even 100,000 people. So when there are votes taken at the United Nations, it's possible for 128 nations that only represent 8% of the world's population to vote together in order to get 2/3 of a vote on a particular resolution. On the other hand, it would be possible, he says, for 65 nations with a combined population below 1% of the world total to block a particular resolution. So because of this problem, different people, besides Joe, have proposed different systems of weighted voting. So let me go through the two most famous ones that came before Joe's proposal and show how Joe's proposal is an improvement over theirs. In 1966, Grenville Clark and Louis Sohn proposed that there would be layer voting in the General Assembly based on simply population. And so their proposal was that the top 4 nations in population at that time, China, India, Soviet Union, and the United States, they would get 30 votes each whenever a resolution would come before the General Assembly. Then according to their plan, the next 10 most populous nations would get 12 votes each. The next 15 in population would get 8 votes each. The next 20 would get 6 votes each. The next 30 would get 4 votes each. The next 40 would get 3 votes each, and all the rest would just get 1 vote each. So that system of layership was simply based on population. And the problem Joe sees in Clark and Sohn's proposal is that it's possible with increases or decreases in a country's population that they could move from a layer to layer. So in 1984, Richard Hudson proposed the binding triad idea of weighted voting, which is an improvement over the Clark and Sohn proposal in the sense that Richard Hudson includes the idea of taking into consideration the contribution to the UN as a factor besides population. So just as the name implies, binding triad, it would there would be votes taken in the General Assembly that would be counted 3 times. So on the one count, each member would have 1 vote, as is currently the situation, but a vote would have to be passed by 2/3 majority. Then under the second count, second tabulation, the vote of each member would be multiplied by its population, but there would be a cap of 15% so that no one nation could get anything higher than 15% on that leg of the vote. Then on the third tabulation, the vote would be multiplied by each member's contribution to the UN with another cap of 15%. And for a resolution to pass according to Richard Hudson's binding triad proposal, you would need 2/3 favorable vote on each of those 3 legs. Now, Joe thinks that the problem with the binding triad proposal is that it gives too much weight to the countries with small populations because, again, they could you could have a 2/3 vote simply by getting enough small countries added together. Also, there's the problem of whether richer countries could somehow affect the voting of less populated countries. So there could be a problem of grafting that Joe would be afraid of. So in art, and also Joe thinks that it would be very difficult to have a resolution pass on all 3 legs. Maybe you might get 1 or 2, but to have a resolution pass on all 3 legs of the binding triad, he thinks would be very difficult. So what Joe proposes then in this book, and has been arguing for many years, is that what you need to do is to take those same considerations of Hudson's binding triad proposal, but turn them into an equation. And if you've been able to read chapter 2 of his book, you know then that the equation is that the weighted vote would equal the population factor of each country plus its contribution to the UN budget plus its membership, which would be the same for each country, 1 out of 193 or 0.518, and then divide that by 3 for the weighted vote for each country. So in his book then, in his different charts and in his text, he explains what that would practically mean when you take a vote in the UN General Assembly, that each country would have its own weighted vote, meaning a different percentage of the vote. So, for example, the country that would have the largest weighted vote currently would be China, although when Joe published his book a few years ago and used 2010 statistics, the United States got the largest vote in the General Assembly, having the largest weighted vote. But that has changed in the last couple of years. And I'll go over that point later on to show I think that's one of the strengths of Joe's proposal, is that when population changes in different countries or when the contribution to the UN changes, then a country's weighted vote could change. But as it currently stands with 2018 statistics, China would have the largest weighted vote, which would be 10.587. So you can just round it up to 10.5. and that's because of its large population. Then secondly, the United States would have a weighted vote of 9.237, so round that off to 9.2. And that's because even though the United States has only 4.4% of the world's population, its contribution to the UN system is 22%, making it the largest so far. But then after that, the weighted votes go down. India would have the weighted vote of 7% of the vote, mainly because of its population. And then Japan would have 3.3%, Germany 2.2%, Brazil 2.1%, Indonesia 1.7%, Russia 1.7%, France 1.7%, UK 1.5%, Italy 1.3%, Mexico 1.2%, Nigeria 1.2%, Pakistan 1.1%, and Canada 1.1%. So I just read off the countries that would have a weighted vote above 1, which all nations currently have. And then for the other 178 current members of the United Nations, their weighted vote would be less than 1. And the countries with the smallest population and smallest contribution to the UN, their vote would be 0.173. So that would be a dramatic change for a number of, from those countries and for other countries that currently have 1 vote in the General Assembly like every other country. But under Joe's formula, their vote would be less than 1. Now, I just mentioned before how things can change according to that formula when population changes and contribution to the UN changes. What I did is I listed the weighted vote according to Joe's published book and how things have changed now in 2018. And I mentioned how the United States originally had the highest weighted vote according to this formula, but now has the second largest weight. Now China has the largest weighted vote, and before it had the second one. A number of countries have gone up in the last couple of years, mainly because of population. India, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, Mexico, Pakistan, Canada, and Nigeria, their weighted vote, according to the current statistics, would be higher than what they were when Joe's book was published, whereas Japan's, Germany's, France, UK, Italy, Spain, and Bangladesh would be lower than what's printed in Joe's book. So that just shows that things can change based on the different factors that are a part of that vote. Now, in order to have this system created, Joe says that all you'd really have to do is to change a few sentences in Article 18 of the UN Charter. So that's important because it wouldn't really take a major overhaul of the whole system, just changing Article 18. And I looked up Article 18, and it simply says every member of the General Assembly shall have 1 vote. So you change that sentence according to Joe to simply read that each member's vote would be based on this formula. And then in Article 18, it talks about how on certain decisions, 2/3 majority would be needed, and on other decisions, just a majority vote would be needed. Well, Joe would keep that with the weighted voting system, saying that on certain questions, you would need particular, maybe a weighted vote on procedural questions, but on questions that concern other matters like charter revision, recommendations to the Security Council, questions about peacekeeping operations, those Joe suggests would need maybe a 2/3 vote based on the weighted voting system. And then some other questions, he says, might even need a 3/4 vote. So according to the advantage, I think, of Joe's system is that on certain questions, you need a supermajority. So even though China would have 10% of the vote, and the United States would have 9% of the vote under Joe's formula, still you need many other countries that have large populations and contributions to the UN system in order to get even a simple majority, much less a supermajority vote. So his formula takes away the possibility that any one country or group of countries could somehow pass a resolution that would be binding on all countries in the UN system. It's still going to take a large majority in order to pass such a resolution. Now, the other strength of Joe's proposal is, as you mentioned in Chapter 2, is that the formula could be changed in maybe 15, 30 years from now as people see around the world that the formula works and that resolutions can be passed in a democratic way through the General Assembly. Of course, right now, under one nation, one vote, the system is not democratic. So all the proposals for weighted voting, the Clark and Soames, Richard Hudson's binding triad, and Joe's proposal are attempts to try and make the system democratic. Now, according to Joe's proposal, though, with the formula of P plus C plus M, population plus contribution plus membership divided by 3, he says you could change that in the future and give double weight to the population part of the formula and double the contribution formula, and then simply divide it by 5 instead of 3. And then later on, you could even increase the population factor by 3 and keep the population factor at 2 times what he originally proposes, and then divide the whole thing by 6. So the beauty of Joe's formula is it can be modified in future years and give population a greater part of the country's weighted vote, and that way it would really be a more democratic system and represent the will of the people of the world. So weighted voting is also part of Joe's proposal in the Security Council and in other parts of organs of the UN, but of course those are in other chapters, and those discussions will take place in the future. So today we're simply concerned about how Joe's formula of P plus C plus M divided by 3 would radically change the voting in the UN General Assembly. And then that change means there would no longer be non-binding resolutions, but would be world law that all nations of the world would be expected to follow. And as world federalists, of course, we are concerned of how to create world law and then how to apply it to individuals who violate that world law. So that's where the other chapters in Joe's book are so important, to show how that system could come about simply by changing the formula to weighted voting. Okay, so that's my general overview, and I think what we need to do then and the rest of the time is to maybe clear up any questions that people might have, or any possible things that might go wrong in this particular system that Joe proposes.
Yeah, I want to thank you very much, David. And in particular, I really appreciate your comparison between the Clark and Soames binding triad and then Joe's proposal for weighted voting, because I haven't understood it in the past. Because there were so many numbers and mathematical calculations in your talk, I'm wondering if we could ask you to send that to us in writing, and I can upload that on our website, so as people are watching the video, they can follow along with that. I think that would be extremely helpful. I'm very glad to see that Joe and Louise have joined us, but are you able to hear us, Joe? It seems like they've been struggling there, so I'm thinking that somehow they're having difficulty, and I can't, I don't even see that their microphone is on, so that I can't mute or unmute them. So I think that Joe, at this point at least, can't join us. But what I wanted to share with you before we start the discussion, I think some of you are aware that the Workable World Trust, Joe's trust, donated $5,000 to the a Model UN program that was held in February in Mexico City. For those of you that know Nicole Wilsey-Starr, who's active with the Citizens for Global Solutions Board, National Board, she's the executive director of that conference. And so this was the first time ever, as far as we know, that UN reform was actually modeled at a Model UN conference anywhere in the world, as far as we know. And they actually showed how the weighted voting would work in the General Assembly. And I could explain more details, but I wanted to read some brief notes from the report that I received after, because the students basically, as you'll see, felt that the weighted voting wasn't fair to smaller countries, that the big P5 are again getting even more power, and they really wanted to see weighted voting implemented in the Security Council, but not in the General Assembly. Now, they didn't know everything that we know from reading the book, the chapter in full, but I wanted to share you this, and I thought it might be a good place for us to kick off our discussion. The 60 students who were in the General Assembly track received their packets explaining weighted voting at the conference, and it actually was expected to be pre-conference homework that they received, you know, weeks or months before, but they just received it when they got there, so really had no time to read it. So the plan for next time is definitely that we'll create very short snippets of information that they would get, you know, every month or every couple weeks, that would introduce them to the UN and then to the unfair system of one nation, one vote, and how weighted voting would work. During the conference, organizers talked about weighted voting a little each day. In total, about an hour and a half was devoted to it. None of the students had heard about weighted voting prior to coming to this conference. Most of them had not really thought about the need for UN reform before. The students were very engaged and very excited when talking about UN reform voting, but they are hesitant about it being used in the General Assembly. The majority of students indicated that they would like to have weighted voting part of the Security Council for future conferences. The students were concerned about P5's true intentions with weighted voting. They brought up the countries with high populations of the US and China already have the veto power in the Security Council, and this would give them even more power. The majority were concerned about how smaller countries would lose their voice in this process. As one delegate mentioned, quote, "The smaller countries were subdued by larger nations and having to beg them for what they need," unquote. Weighted voting, they argued, diminishes the diversity and voices of the UN. And just to let you know that because there was so much excitement about UN reform, they are planning to model some aspect of UN reform at the Chicago Model UN in December. The Highland Park High School in New Jersey, we funded grants for a number of those students who were low income to travel to Mexico City. They actually won the top prize at the conference, and they're planning to implement UN reform in their next Model UN here in the US. Nicole, who was in charge of Mexico City, also is in charge of the Chicago one and several others, and so she has, you know, quite a bit of impact on this getting implemented. And then Andrea Klein-Bergman, who we send from here in Minnesota, runs a Model UN program here, but also is very connected to the national leaders of Model UN for the US. So I think there's a lot of potential for trying out aspects of reform of the UN within the Model UN programs throughout the world. So that's exciting. But I thought that this reaction to the General Assembly there was very important and an interesting addition to our discussion of what David just explained to us. Joe, can you hear us or can we hear you? We lost him totally there. Okay, anyway, I'll just open it up for discussion at this point. I think you're all unmuted. Any thoughts, anyone? Donna, go ahead.
So it seems, I wish Joe, maybe after I make my comment, I'll go out and call Joe to see if I can help him, because I think he needs to get out of Zoom and turn on his microphone. Remember, I had that problem once where you couldn't hear me.
Okay.
So anyway, I just want to say that I feel that, I mean, I appreciate what the students, I'm glad you brought up the reaction from the young students, because one of our big issues is reaching out to the young, and we see Model UN as a wonderful way to do that, and Citizens for Global Solution hopes that hopes to continue this work with Model UNs, both with Nicole's and with others. But I think the thing that I would like to say to the students, I feel like the concern that holding the one nation, one vote as the most important aspect of the General Assembly is reinforcing that made up notion of nations being more important than people. And that to me, the most important issue of sovereignty should be the individual people. Each person is what has dignity and value and needs to be respected. And that somehow we need to try to open people's thinking to think about that what's most important is the individual, not the nation. And so trying to give weight to more based on the number of people seems like a much more ethical, moral, whatever, way to go about it. So that was all I wanted to say.
But I would argue to that. I mean, I think in some ways, each of Joe's proposals could be implemented separately, but in many ways, they're so interrelated. So, Donna, you're talking about the power to the people, that every person counts. But when 1.3 billion of them are from China, and the vote that China gets is whatever their government believes in, not necessarily, you're not asking the people what they believe in. So that's a reason why a UN Parliamentary Assembly, for instance, would be a place where people's voices actually could, at least in an advisory fashion, but hopefully eventually in some kind of binding fashion, could actually be part of the equation, right? Mm-hmm. And then, reform of this, in some ways, the P5 or those, the P5, I guess I'm mostly talking about, being able to have a bigger weight in the General Assembly, in a sense, would be a reason for them to consider giving up the veto power in the Security Council, right? So some of these things play off each other. Also, the matter of funding, Joe's proposal is talking about funds being weighted differently, and there'd be quite a bit more funding going to the UN than there is right now. So all of these things kind of play with each other and makes this one, and then what the one thing I'll quote here too is on page 29 of Joe's book. Joe's addressing the issue that that all of the countries whose weight is going to be less than 1 is losing power, quote unquote. But what he says is, and he was talking about I don't have the exact number here, but certain number of countries, well, maybe it's all the ones below 1 vote, 1. He says 40% of something, an empowered GA that can respond effectively to the needs of the weak, is more favorable to their long-term interests than their present 84% of the votes in what might, in practical terms, be regarded as virtually nothing. So right now, while they might feel powerful because they have 1 vote and 2/3 of them can pass a resolution, that resolution has no binding, it has no meaning other than a feel-good resolution that is often ignored. So I guess that, that's one part of the explanation to the students that didn't get out there. And so their reaction makes me realize that we have to think very carefully about what kind of chunks of information we're giving to the students so they get more of a holistic picture. Because they're there, they're representing some one country, they're probably representing, so many of them, a very small country, and they're experiencing this reality that China or the US have, this big weight, and they're just a little tiny vote, and it doesn't seem to count. Any other thoughts?
I was disappointed in Nicole's report to us that students thought that in the General Assembly. It should continue with one nation, one vote, so that they still hold on to some power. But I think that you could reduce that argument to an absurdity by creating a nation of just one person on one island. And let's say I was one person on one island and I was able to get UN membership. Does that mean then that one person in the world should have the same kind of vote as nations that have millions or even billions of people involved? Even if a government such as China determines that vote, well, the same thing goes for the United States or for any other country. So that's the importance of Joe's proposal of balancing the parliamentary assembly, which eventually could be a bicameral legislature, for creating world law. But I just feel that, you know, the students who wanted to hold on to one nation, one vote just don't get the math. You don't understand, you know, the simple problem of we're talking about units here, national units, but national units are not equal in size. They're not equal in other ways. That's why you need a formula for weighted voting.
Donna, did you reach Joe?
I reached Louise and I suggested that they try to turn on their microphone first. They sounded very frustrated and they had just given up. And I said, well, just try to get your microphone on. I think your mic's not on, but I couldn't help them because they have a Mac, but that she was going to try again and then call back into Zoom if they can get their mic on.
The mute is up on the first row of things on the Mac.
Well, they're not here.
Ben, I see you raising your hand. Go ahead.
As I was listening to David Otten, whom I love, and as I was thinking of Joe's book, that which I love, the idea occurred to me, has anybody figured out the advantages, perhaps in mathematical terms, of the difference in advantage of solving differences by nonviolent means and solving them by force, by violence, by war? There's no comparison between war and solving things in a sensible and humane manner. And we never talk about that. We don't have any formula for that.
I think the formula is the military budgets of the world. And of course, that now is over about $1.5 trillion per year. And unfortunately, under the current U.S. administration, the U.S. is spending about half of that. And all the other countries combined then are spending the other half. So, I mean, that's the formula right there. The amount of money that each government in the world spends for defense.
It doesn't make any sense. It's irrational and inhumane. Every war is a defeat. It's a defeat for our reason and for our humanity.
Well, it's been estimated that if we would reduce the military budgets of the world by even 10%, we could house and feed and educate everyone. So that just shows that we're not solving many of our global problems because so much money is diverted into military expenditures. So one proposal to do that is to agree on a formula of reducing the military expenditures of each country by a percentage, maybe even 1% a year. That would take 100 years, but at least it would be a step in the right direction. And as long as there would be general agreement by all the countries of the world to do that, along with changing the voting system in the UN General Assembly and Security Council, that would be an important step in moving towards a world federation.
I agree.
Donna, I see you want to talk, and I'm going to let you do that, but I'm just going to give Vicki or Jean, the two on the phone, a chance to say something if they'd like to. Feel free to just jump right in if you want to say something. Okay, go ahead, Donna. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, this is Jean. I just wanted to say thank you, Father Ben. That's exactly what was on my mind, and I'm really just listening in on this. I don't really have a lot to contribute.
That's great. Thank you.
Hi, this is Vicki. I'm a listener too, so I'm enjoying this, but don't have anything to add.
Okay. Well, I won't call on you necessarily, but just feel free to jump in at any time if you do. Donna.
Okay.
Something Ben just said reminded me of a woman named Erica Chenoweth. Remember Erica? She does research on comparing nonviolent versus violent ways of making changes. And I have forgotten about her till you just mentioned this again. And when I wasn't quite so consumed with CGS work, I used to check out her stuff from time to time. So maybe I need to make some time, because she's got data on how nonviolent methods are more successful at making change versus violence. So even if we can't convince people about the military, there's other perhaps ways of talking about that. The other thing I just wanted to say was that even though I agree with, I heard Dave Otten's sort of frustration that the students, and my frustration too, that I don't think the most important thing should be national sovereignty. Their reaction to work in the General Assembly, I feel like we ought to respect and sort of, I love their idea of tackling the Security Council, even though it might not be where politically, I've heard people say, well, you can't really fix the Security Council. But if that's where the energy is of the young people, I'd say let's follow it. That's, if we could fix the Security Council. Right now, fixing the General Assembly wouldn't, do a whole lot. But fixing the Security Council could be immense. And especially since the same idea of weighted voting, and the idea of representation for the Security Council in Joe's chapter when we get there. I love the idea of going there. It sort of, if that's what draws young people, I'm all for that.
Yeah, well, I think one thing I learned certainly is that we need to do I think even the study guide that we wrote for this topic, at least, didn't really address the arguments that would come to it. It more laid it out sort of as David did in his introduction of the logical reason why this should and how the formula would work, but it didn't really go into too much of the arguments against it and why it would still be a good idea. So I think part of it is how do we lay out that pre-homework in a way that the students could arrive at the conference with that broader understanding. Secondly, just, Joe, the Workable World Trust absolutely plans to remain engaged financially and intellectually with this idea of model UN and UN reform. And so we've definitely talked about GA modified in how it's presented, Security Council, and also UN Parliamentary Assembly. That could be something that would be very exciting to implement in a model UN. And Andreas Bummel was here in Minneapolis over the weekend, and I mentioned that to him. And since then, I've talked to Joe, and of those three ideas, Joe thinks UNPA may be the best thing to try to implement at Model UN, just because it's got some momentum in the world right now for something like that to happen. And that would be exactly what you were talking about, Donna, that people have a voice. There'd even be representatives for indigenous people that are in the assembly. So we'll hear next month Andreas Bummel will be our speaker. So he'll actually be joining us to lead the discussion on that.
I see a hand in the air.
Father Hurd would like to say something too when it's our turn.
Yeah, Flo, were you? I'll call on Bob next. Flo, were you?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think, reinforce your point, Nancy, that it's perhaps, I think their reaction is, I'm not surprised by it. I've been at UN models when I was young, and the countries I had to represent were like Zimbabwe and Myanmar. So these fears, I think, are common because they are not seeing the whole picture, right? When you read the book, you get that whole idea that all these reforms would go together. But let's face it, the Security Council reform is, I think, the thing that everybody is the most aware of. Even people that don't really know about the UN system and all its related agencies and didn't read Joe's book still know that this idea of the P5 is way too anachronistic to exist. But if you read the book, and especially I'm thinking of that table that I think you created, that maybe we can share with everyone, that sort of ranks the proposals, not only in terms of priority, but also in terms of feasibility. So we know that talking about the UN General Assembly right now, perhaps is not easier, none of this is gonna be easier, but less polemic than thinking about the Security Council. And then there's also the idea that I think you mentioned that we would sort of motivate these countries that would be losing the veto power by an increase, at least temporarily increased power in the General Assembly, so we can trick them into thinking that they are not losing so much power. I also wanted to mention a paper from the Frederick Everts team, sorry, I have it here, the FES organization, about the role of the President of the General Assembly. I think we can share that with everyone. It mentions a lot of other things that are happening with the role of the General Assembly that may be also good to throw in this discussion. It's not only about the non-binding power and about the weighted voting, but it mentions the role of the President being higher up and having a very diplomatic importance in the world next to the Secretary General, and a lot of things like campaigns like the 1 for 7 million, having like there's a lot of praise for the role of the President of the General Assembly in those campaigns, and for the role in trying to make some member nations understand that non-state actors have a huge role to play in the General Assembly discussions. And also the idea of the staff of the General Assembly changing every year with the new president, and how this is very inefficient. I just thought we would share that paper with everyone because it brings up other things about the General Assembly that need to be reviewed.
Great. Yeah, send that to me and I'll link it on the website. Bob.
I was just going to mention something that surprised me when I read page 30 of our book, where it says that the General Assembly, since it started in 1946, has passed about one resolution a day. And I don't think I could name hardly 3 or 4 of them. And so maybe there could be some more publicizing of what the General Assembly does, so that we have more status and importance.
And we can even put a link to the place where you can read all those resolutions on our website as well. But of course, they're non-binding. So in some ways, they're feel-good resolutions. People can feel morally good about the fact that they passed something, but that doesn't mean anything happens. There's no money behind it. There's no teeth behind it at all. I see a hand in South Bay. Is that a hand?
Hi, yeah, we think it's important in trying to convince the young people and other people about.
We can't hear you.
You can't hear me at all?
Well, we can barely. Be as close to the mic as you can.
I'm right, yeah, I'm right. My face is right in the camera here. But, when I'm talking to the Model UN people and other people to convince them about the weighted voting, is we need to say that if we get the weighted voting, then we also want to have the votes binding. And that's an important trade-off for and it's mentioned in Joe's book that the advantage of to a country who's going to have less voting power than they currently have is that then the resolutions that they've been passing one a day since 1945 would actually be binding, and so that's quite a trade-off. Whereas today, what happens? They pass one resolution every day on the average, but it's not binding on anybody. So that's the trade-off that is part of the sales pitch for introducing weighted voting.
Thank you, Larry. Gail?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Yeah, this presents a logistical problem, and that is that something that could be a wonderful idea in a certain context might not be a good idea in another context. And so we're assuming that all these recommendations that Joe has will be implemented and look at it as a whole, but in actuality, they almost certainly will not be implemented that way. So I'm just observing that presents a logistical problem.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I have another comment too, and that is maybe young people could relate to the Citizens Coordinating Council and get excited about that, because that might be a start. I can't see any downside of that. I mean, I don't see any condition where in one context it would be a bad idea versus a good idea. So that's just a thought that came to mind.
Okay, well, and I'll explain for everyone. Gail's referring to, I don't know what chapter that is, but it's Civil Society Coordinating Councils. And this would be a way that there, I believe, be 5 subject areas, human rights being one and the environment being one, and et cetera. And so all of the various civil society organizations within any, let's say all of the human rights civil society organizations would form a civil society coordinating council. Right now, every civil society organization puts out their annual report, and there's millions of them. Literally, there's millions of them. So the only ones that get read, even the executive summary, are the really big names, which, usually is the global north. Sometimes the smaller organizations that are really on the ground know reality better and have some really brilliant ideas, but those are rarely, if ever, read and heard and considered at the UN. So the idea of these councils, which we'll talk about in a future month, would be that there'd be a way that all of the different civil society organizations could combine their report and put out joint resolutions and joint recommendations. In a nutshell, I don't know quite how a model UN would model that. It's a little challenging, but I agree that it's probably something that has, is very appealing. Because again, it's, the voice of coming from the ground rather than just these nation states with their political motives. Donna.
So I have a question for Dave Otten. Once a semester, Father Ben and I go to Father Bob's class in bioethics and talk about Ben's vision of hope and World Federation. And I do talk about the weighted voting in Joe's book, with the weight going to population and contribution, financial contribution and membership. And a couple times students have felt uncomfortable with the money that the richer nations will have more of a vote. So usually the pushback in that class is not on weighting it for population. That usually makes sense to them. But occasionally, now it's not all the time, but occasionally there's a pushback on the money. And so my response usually is, well, at least then if the US doesn't pay our dues, then our weighted vote goes down, which sounds good. But I wonder, Dave, if you have any other response when you share that. Does anyone ever object, and do you have a different response than I do?
No, that's a common objection to both the binding triad and to Joe's formula that contributions to the UN is even a factor. At least the Clark and Sohm doesn't deal with that. It only deals with population. But the argument that Richard Hudson and Joe Schwartzberg uses is that you're not going to get the countries that actually contribute to the UN, according to the dues system to adopt this weighted voting system unless contribution is a part of it, because they're paying for the most of how the UN works. Another argument then would be, if contribution is a factor, then that would encourage more countries to not only pay their dues, but actually maybe even contribute more than what they need to pay. And that would raise their vote, or their percentage of the vote according to the formula. You know, what's really sad is the United States government has not even paying what it should pay according to the system. It should pay at least 28 to 30% of the operating budget of the UN, and it said no, we're not going to pay more than 22%. So whenever a country simply decides on its own what its own percentage is going to be, I mean, that's a problem. You know, for years when Jesse Helms was the chair of the Senate committee that regulated UN funding, that's when we didn't even pay our dues and had to pay our dues in arrears for a number of years. So there's a problem with how to fund the UN, and the current system simply isn't a good way of doing it, of having dues and then expecting countries to pay those dues. If you make it part of their voting percentage, then it encourages all countries to not only pay their dues, but maybe even pay more. Under our present situation with Trump as president and now John Bolton as his national security advisor, it's extremely important that the majority of the U.S. population get away from Bolton's ideas of seeing the UN as simply irrelevant, and the U.S. and other countries can pretty much do whatever they want. They want to ignore the UN altogether and simply do what they think they can get by with as far as their national interest is. So I think, you know, we're really fighting against an attitude that, you know, nobody should tell us what to do. That's certainly Trump's attitude and Bolton's attitude. But the argument has to be that it's in the United States' best interest, long-range interest, and in other countries' interest to support the UN. Another thing that I respond to people who bring up the contributions is, do you realize how little the UN budget is compared to national budgets? The operating budget now for the whole UN system is only about $4 billion a year. The individuals, $4 billion sounds like a big number, but it's nothing compared to the UN budget, which is way over $1 trillion. So of that $4 billion that the UN counts on to run its different programs, the United States is supposed to pay about $1 billion. But consider the difference between $1 billion for our UN dues compared to $600 to $700 billion in military budget. It's just ridiculous. I mean, that's where the United States and many other countries should greatly increase their UN dues voluntarily in order to try and make the world more peaceful. It would save them so much money. But many people are short-sighted and don't see the importance of the contribution leg in the formula of weighted voting.
To what David was go ahead, David.
One other thing. Another statistic that's really important to me, or that I point out, is that every state in the United States has a bigger budget than the UN does. So think of Delaware, Wyoming, Rhode Island, countries that have very small state budgets. That's still greater than the budget of the United Nations. So the United Nations has done so much on so little, and yet some people don't even want to support that because they're only thinking in terms of national interest and what's good for their own country rather than what's good for the world.
Related directly to what David was just talking about, I'll point out that page 38 of the study guide has a chart where Joe is comparing the U.S. share of the assessed budget to the UN, you know, with boxes showing the size difference of the defense budget, New York City expenditures. I mean, this is a great graphic to demonstrate that,
Right.
as well as some of the statistics that David just listed. Donna, everything David said was very helpful, but I might just also add on page 21 of the book, at the bottom, there's a quote. You might want to just have this quote along with you when you go to Bob's class. It's a quote at the bottom of the page, and it's from a report by the high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change. And it reads in part, recommendations for UN reform that ignore underlying power realities will be doomed to failure or irrelevance. But recommendations that simply reflect raw distributions of power and make no effort to bolster international principles are unlikely to gain the widespread support required to shift international behavior. So, I mean, right now, one nation, one vote is completely an artificial calculation of, you know, the sovereign, it's based on the sovereign equality of nations, period, that each of them is equal. But that's not a logical way to form a, you know, it's like outside in the rest of the world that doesn't work. And that's why the resolutions are just not taken seriously. Someone else in Cincinnati, or looks like they're having their own discussion.
We are. Father Ben needs to leave, and so we're just trying to figure out how to get him out.
Well, we'll say goodbye, Father Ben. Thanks for joining. We'll see you next month. Any other thoughts anyone wants to add? Okay, well, Larry, go ahead. You're muted. Can you unmute, or I can unmute you if you need?
So,
there we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
So it occurs to me that it's very interesting that the General Assembly has essentially no power, no way to make binding resolutions, no relationship to population power or money in any way, and yet people or especially the smaller countries, just cling to it because it is the only place where there's a microphone that they get to have once in a while to say something to everybody else. And that really is the only value that it presents. And even with that limited value in most respects, it's amazing how much people in the smaller countries especially will try to be involved in the UN because there is a microphone there. And it's just, they'll spend a lot of money, they'll spend way more than is proportional to their budgets or whatever to get representation at the General Assembly and to be present there, because it feels to them like they're counting for something. And it really shows the hunger of people to have representation, even in a forum that's totally stacked against anything they could ever accomplish. That's all.
Good point, Larry. Well, and there is, in a sense, a moral power that comes out of resolutions, although because they're, you know, produced almost daily and most of us don't know what hardly any of them are, maybe that's not really true. But, you know, I guess they may not have any implementation power, but they have some moral implications, I would say. Would others agree with me on that?
Sure.
Yep.
I mean, even the nuclear treaty, would that have come out of the General Assembly action initially? Anyone know?
What are you talking about? What treaty? The SALT?
Oh, just the one that was passed last year. I don't know if it's a treaty or. the nuclear non-proliferation, is that what it's called?
Oh, your protocol, sure.
I mean, those things are discussed in the General Assembly, but again, there's not, you know, they're not implementable, but at the same time, they do create they have a certain kind of moral weight that perhaps is part of the movement of humanity in a more moral, humanistic direction, a more democratic direction. I'm not saying the General Assembly should stay as it is, but, you know, we're basically implying that they have absolutely no value. But I think those discussions, and because you were saying it gives them a stage, it gives them an ability to have a voice on the global stage. That is true. And there is some amount of moral weight to that.
But there's a difference between value and power. So the resolutions of the General Assembly have value because they resolve what should be the case and how nations should interact with each other. But as far as creating laws, that's where they lack power.
Right. Or any kind of financial backing behind doing something with them. Right. Well, I think we're winding down. There's no reason we need to stretch ourselves out to 12:30. So one final call if anyone has something to add. Otherwise, we'll wrap up. Okay. So thank you very much for joining. I will get this video, now that I have the web page set up, I'll get the video up much more quickly than I did last time, along with a number of the various documents and links that were referred to during our discussion today. And I'll just remind you that next month will be Saturday, May 12th, again, the second Saturday in May. And we'll be talking about creation of a World Parliamentary Assembly or UN Parliamentary Assembly. I highly recommend that you look at the website for the campaign for a UNPA. I don't know the exact website, but I can send you the web link out just to see what's actually happening, because it's actually a pretty vibrant campaign. And also Andreas Bummel, along with Jo Leinen, just this month published a book called A World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century. And I think it's only about, I don't know, $15 at most for the e-version and about $20 for the printed version. It had been written originally in German and now it's been translated. But it's quite a book, 400 pages, I believe, but it gives a really a historical, global historical view of all of the kind of the movement toward parliamentary assemblies throughout the world, and then looking at various global problems and how a parliamentary assembly could, you know, help resolve those problems. So,
what is the title of the book?
I'll send a link, but it is called A World Parliament, Governance and Democracy in the 21st Century. And it's available currently through Amazon and soon through other booksellers, etc. But right now go to Amazon to get it. It just had a book launch at the UN on Wednesday. That was the reason Andreas was in the US and was able to visit us here. So he will be our moderator next month. So we're going to learn from the global expert on, you know, where our movement is for the UNPA. So that should be very exciting and well worth your time. So thank you everyone for joining, and I'll sign off for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy.
Bye.
Bye.